A cave diver with the strange rule of diving visited Little River Springs. Basically, on most of his dives, he takes just enough air to explore and exit. He trusted his precision so much until he encountered a silt-out condition in the deep waters of Little River Springs. Little River Springs is one of the most attractive natural spots in North Florida. It covers around 125 acres of land in Suwannee River County Park. The temperature of the spring stays the same all year at 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The spring is about 150 feet long, and there's a cave system inside that's over 1,200 feet long. The cave has a main tunnel and some smaller paths when you go down to 90 to 100 feet deep. When you go deeper into the cave, you'll notice that the cave's layout transforms. It gets narrower and wider, and its walls and floors are covered in more thick mud compared to the start of the cave. In the beginning, there are big rocky pathways with clear waters that divers use. If you manage to reach the cave's end, you'll come to something called the well casing. This is where a farmer made a well to use the really clear water from the spring. When the water isn't high or disturbed by people, the gentle and curved movement of the spring is nice, especially when it flows into the Suwannee River. When things are just right, the water in the river is so clear that you can hardly see it. There's a flat piece of limestone just below the water's surface in the river. This lets visitors stand right near the entrance of the cave and look down into it without getting too wet. There are gaps in the limestone close to where the water comes out, and these gaps create a pool. This pool is perfect for walking in the water, swimming, and using a snorkel. George Banks worked as a librarian, but he was passionate about cave diving. He'd been known to take big risks, which he also did when he went cave diving. He began cave diving while he was in college and got the proper certification for it. Once he got certified, he started doing a lot of diving on his own. George had a reputation for using a different rule for managing the gas he used underwater, which is not the usual way cave divers do it. He even shared his unique gas strategy with a group of fellow cave divers on 2 occasions. Basically, George made sure to save enough gas for diving, exploring, and getting out of parts of the cave that he already knew. He won't take any extra air along. He began doing this because of a challenge, and it quickly became his unique way of diving most of the time. However, this approach is risky because it doesn't leave room for mistakes or unexpected things to happen. It's not as safe as the usual rule called the rule of thirds, where you use 1/3 of your gas for going inside the cave, 1/3 for exiting the cave, and the remaining third in case of emergency. This prepares divers for any unexpected turn of events while underwater. George's upcoming underwater adventure was set at the Little River Spring. Accompanied by his buddy Albert, he was all geared up for the dive. Both of them were skilled and authorized to explore caves underwater. This was not the first time diving into the depths of Little River Springs Cave. They had dived there twice in the past. However, the night before this dive was different for George. Sleep eluded him as he lay there, restless. Unlike previous dives, a sense of unease had settled in. He found himself feeling worried and anxious about this specific dive. George shared his concerns with Albert, explaining his uneasy feelings about the upcoming dive. However, when Albert attempted to dissuade him from diving, George didn't take his advice seriously and went ahead with his plans. Seeing George's determination, Albert came up with a suggestion. He proposed that instead of sticking to his usual gas management approach, George should follow the rule of thirds, which is a diving principle. This way, if his uneasy feelings held any truth, he would have an extra air supply and be prepared for any unexpected situation. Unfortunately, George insisted on sticking to his own gas management rule, which meant he planned to use only enough gas for the dive and nothing more. In the morning, they began their underwater adventure. Each person had a special scooter. They had a plan for a dive that would last for about 70 minutes. To explore more of the underwater area, they decided to use these scooters. The scooters help divers by letting them use less air and swim faster to different parts of the water. They needed to follow the main gold line underwater, which is pretty close to a marker that's about 100 feet away. George and Albert, who were both experienced and qualified divers, carried on with their underwater explorations. They had a plan in place. Once they reached the well casing point, they would begin their ascent back to the surface. While getting to the well casing was considered risky, George and Albert's expertise made them feel confident. The Little River featured a primary tunnel that was the main route. Following this main tunnel, divers would reach a depth of 90 feet. At this depth, the main tunnel splits into two pathways, the Serpentine Way and the Merry-Go-Round tunnels. Divers had the choice of proceeding through either of these tunnels. It's important to note that both of these tunnels eventually came together again in the large Florida room. This complex network of tunnels offered George and Albert various options for their underwater journey. To reach the well casing, they needed to follow the permanent line that led them into the cave by making a sharp left turn. As they continued diving deeper, it was crucial to keep their visibility clear so they wouldn't lose their way. Moving forward, they had to dive through a place called the Dome Room. Here, the floor dropped lower, and they had to swim over a big pile of sand that had fallen from above. This part was different from the rocky pathways they had passed through earlier. Instead of rocks, the floor was covered with a thick layer of mud and silt. When they took their scooters with them down to this part, they had to turn the scooters off and park them to the side. This was because they wouldn't need the scooters for the next leg of their journey. They eventually got to the well casing and gave an OK signal to start their ascent. Albert took the lead, with George behind. While they were making their way out, Albert suddenly felt like his friend George had stopped following him. After continuing forward for a distance of about 50 feet, Albert realized that he was all alone now. George wasn't anywhere to be seen. This discovery confused Albert because he had assumed George was right behind him. Feeling puzzled, Albert decided to retrace his steps and head back to the well casing to see if he could find George there or nearby. However, when he arrived at the well casing, something surprising occurred. The well casing had become covered in silt, making the wall's surface look disturbed. This disturbance led to a decrease in the clarity of the water, making it harder to see clearly. The unexpected change in the conditions further added to the challenge Albert was facing. Albert had trouble seeing anything clearly, but he didn't wait around for too long. He began searching for George in the silty water. After a bit of searching, he managed to find George and grab him. However, Albert had to let go quite quickly because he needed to fix his scooter on the line. Once he had successfully fixed it, he tried to grab onto George once more. Unfortunately, by then, George had disappeared. He had gotten lost in the murky water again. Even though Albert couldn't see well, he entered the water with poor visibility and started searching for his friend. He kept swimming through the silty conditions until he reached clearer waters. Albert began hitting his tank, hoping George would hear and come back to the clear water. Eventually, he stopped making the loud noise. He thought maybe George had heard it and moved ahead of him, leaving the spring. Albert then started the process of decompression as he ascended. When he finally reached the surface, he was surprised not to find George there. He realized that George might have gotten lost in the silt. He felt worried and scared for his friend's safety. He decided to call out for help. Albert was panicking because George had only a limited amount of air left to leave the underwater cave. This meant that there was a significant risk of a terrible accident happening to his friend. The situation was very serious, and Albert was deeply concerned about what might happen next. Albert managed to locate one of the officers at Little River Springs. At that time, George had stayed inside the cave for an extra 35 minutes before they got ready to search for him. During this period, Albert started to lose hope of finding George alive. The situation was not looking good. Two divers bravely entered the cave to search for George, but unfortunately, their efforts didn't lead to any success. The area inside the cave was filled with a lot of silt, making it very difficult to see or find anything. Because of the dangerous conditions, the divers had no choice but to come out of the cave to ensure their safety. They couldn't risk being in danger themselves. After several hours had passed, they decided to start a second search attempt. This time, during the search, they finally spotted George at the far end of a section known as the Florida Room. This area is one of the rooms within the cave and is located about 1,200 feet away from the entrance. Unfortunately, when they found George, he was not moving and appeared lifeless. His tank had run out of air, adding to the tragedy of the situation. As they worked to bring George's body out of the cave, the rescue team also managed to retrieve his scooter. The scooter was all covered with clay and dirt. It seemed that George might have unknowingly stirred up silt while struggling with the scooter underwater. This action could have caused the silt to gather on the propeller of his scooter. This in turn made him lose his sense of direction, and he became confused, especially since he had no extra dive air. Cave diving will always remain dangerous. All divers must know that no one, not even the greatest known diver, can ascertain what will happen in the deep. This is why it's important for all divers or aspirants to strictly follow the rules of cave diving at all times. We would like to thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed watching, take a dive on the like and subscribe buttons and hit the bell icon so you get notified when we come back with another exciting cave diving story.